Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brigitte Weinsteiger. I'm currently serving as the interim director of the Penn Libraries and also normally as the Gershwin and Bennett Family Senior Associate Vice Provost for Collections and Scholarly Communications. And I get the pleasure of welcoming you here tonight and to the first of the 2024 Rosenbach Lectures. As many of you already know, the A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures are the longest running series of lectures on the subject of bibliography in the United States. And this year's lectures, called Toward a History of Black Print, will be delivered by Rosenbach Fellow Elizabeth McHenry. She is a professor in the English department at New York University, where she also serves as the department chair. Professor McHenry's lectures will focus on several overlapping areas of Black print culture studies, the business of printing, the history of Black printers, and the extension of African American literary and print culture. We're very happy to have Professor McHenry here, and you're going to hear more about her work in just a moment. But first, I have some thank yous. I'd like to thank the Rosenbach Lectures Advisory Committee, which consists of scholars, faculty, and staff from across Penn and the larger bibliographic community. The committee is led by Chair and the library's own Lynn Farrington, and the members include Peter Diamond, Jesse Erickson, Glenda Goodman, Devin Patel, Sean Quimby, and Whitney Tretien. Thank you all so much for your dedicated work in organizing this distinguished lecture series. I also want to share tonight that the 2023 Rosenbach lectures that were given by Leah Price on Reading from Home are now available on the Kislak Center's YouTube page. And I'm pleased to announce that our 2025 lectures will be given by Kelly Wisecup, professor of English at Northwestern University and author of Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures. And planning even further ahead, the committee will be announcing the 2026 Rosenbach Fellow later this spring. But back to our lecture series at hand, we have a wonderful lineup of lectures this week. I also have a couple of announcements I want to make before I turn it over. First, there is a reception immediately following the lecture tonight, just outside here. So please join us if you're able. And on Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. in the Lee Library, there will be an informal seminar where you'll get a chance to chat with Liz and ask her any questions. So please join us at 10 a.m. on Wednesday if you're available then too. And now it's my pleasure to invite to the podium Laura Helton, who will be introducing Elizabeth McHenry. Laura Helton is an assistant professor of English and history at the University of Delaware, where she teaches African American literature, archival studies, and public humanities. She is a co-editor of the digital humanities project, Remaking the World of Arturo Schomburg. And her first book will be coming out next month with Columbia University Press, titled Scattered and Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. Join me in welcoming Professor Helton.
Good afternoon. Very pleased to be introducing this first lecture. And I want to start with Elizabeth McHenry's first book. In that book, Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African American Literary Societies, there is a moment that is among my many favorites. It is McHenry's discussion of how in 1837, the colored American newspaper reminded readers to file your papers. Suggesting that readers keep rather than throw away each issue, the editors recommended preserving a file of the journal and binding it so that by the end of the year, they would have a neat little volume capable of amusing and improving their minds. For a reader who could not afford books or access public reading rooms, the colored American could become a library of bound books, McHenry argues, one that would testify to the social, civic, and moral standing of its owner. It is just one moment in a book, dense with illuminating detail, but it encapsulates McHenry's method, an attention to scenes of reading that explode categories, in this case, distinctions between seriality and the bound object, between ephemera and archive, and between those with access to books and those without. Across her scholarship, McHenry deploys this method to attend to the brilliance of forgotten readers and the surprises lurking in texts they read. As McHenry noted in the 2002 introduction to Forgotten Readers, two primary scenes of reading had dominated the study of 19th century African-American literacy up to that point. Frederick Douglass's Learning to Read slave narrative and the redemption tale of New England school teachers in the Reconstruction South. The primacy of those scenes, as well as a critical focus from Du Bois onward on Black oral traditions, had obscured the heterogeneity of Black reading practices, McHenry argued, including the habits of free Black readers and the participation in print publics by people who could not read but were nevertheless engaged with the circulation of texts. McHenry redirected our attention then to the collective work of these forgotten readers, from antebellum literary organizations to Harlem Renaissance salons. I am deeply grateful to have become a student of book history in the wake of forgotten readers. When I was first introduced to material texts nearly 20 years ago through the Rutgers Seminar in the History of the Book just up the road, I thrilled at the methods of a field that it could attend to scrolls and scrolling, to books and bookishness. But I also remember being struck by the distance between the field's core conversations, tightly focused as they often were around the study of early European printed books, and the vibrant adjacent work happening in other fields, such as African American studies, by scholars who wrote about authorship, reading, and publishing, but did not locate themselves within book history as a field. The doors between these worlds often seemed shut. I realized the folly in this particular room of book historians of asserting that epochal change could be pinned to the production of any one text, and yet I suspect I'd find broad agreement that the appearance of forgotten readers shifted conceptual and disciplinary ground. It opened a channel for scholarly transit between fields in ways that have made many careers and projects possible. Revisiting the book recently, I was struck again by the cross-disciplinary conversations that McHenry animates, drawing on Chartier's approaches to the history of reading, on feminist arguments about women's literacy, continuing the work of Dorothy Porter on the history of Black reading societies, and bringing those traditions into dialogue with a then contemporary reading landscape shaped by Oprah's book club. Fittingly, Forgotten Readers received awards not only from the American Studies Association and the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation, but also from the American Library Association and from SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. McHenry's next book, the award-winning 2021 To Make Negro Literature, Writing, Literary Practice, and African American Authorship, also published by Duke, continues what has become a defining characteristic of McHenry's scholarship: to find readers where they are, this time not in the organized settings of literary societies, but rather in door-to-door encounters with sales agents. To Make Negro Literature attends to the postbellum pre-Harlem moment, an era once understood as mired in the literary doldrums, but more recently the subject of much scholarship that revisits not just the canonical works of Paul Laurence Dunbar or Charles Chestnut, but also the work of Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, Anna Julia Cooper, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and many others. McHenry joins this conversation, but rather than focusing on recovering the era's textual treasures, as other scholars have done, she pivots to a set of objects that confound bibliographic and literary interpretation, examples of uncertain authorship, unoriginal writing, unsuccessful ventures, and unremarkable genres. Such objects usually fall outside the story scholars tell of how Black literary culture developed before and after 1900. In McHenry's telling, however, these curious objects are the story. In some chapters, McHenry introduces us to figures at the margins of literary history, such as educator William Krogman, whose Progress of a Race, a colossal, gaudy, cheaply made tome, McHenry tells us, made race literature usable to book buyers in the South and Midwest who had limited access to libraries, bookstores, or formal education. In other chapters, McHenry returns us to canonical figures like Du Bois or Mary Church Terrell, but not for the texts that made them famous, rather for the texts that did not. She attends, for example, to the provisional bibliographies composed by Du Bois and Daniel Murray, describing them as a mode of collective criticism. Lists inspired more lists, McHenry argues, showing us how bibliography operated as a dynamic intellectual space where a range of thinkers staged their proposals for defining the scope and stakes of Black textuality. To bibliographers, I am sure, the stakes of list making have always been apparent. But McHenry's work, has made more broadly visible to scholars across many fields the arguments, surprises, and even drama in bibliographic genres. That methodological intervention has opened up tremendous space for other scholars, catalyzing a suite of recent and in-progress work on Black data and paratext. In short, over the past 2 decades, McHenry has taught us to reimagine what is possible to study. She's done that through her books, to be sure, but as a final note, I want to underscore the impact of her teaching in the classroom as well. I brought a prop for this part. I was lucky many years ago to be a student of Dr. McHenry when she was in the early stages of writing to make Negro literature. In a graduate seminar on the postbellum pre-Harlem era, this was our textbook. 2,000 pages, double-sided, photocopies of McHenry's own research from the Library of Congress. This artifact speaks to the dearth, to be sure, of anthologies, editions, or digitized sources that she could then assign on an understudied period. But it also speaks to the generosity of her pedagogy, letting students in on the uncertainty, the messiness, and the slowness of the kind of scholarship that she carefully undertakes to find a field where others have suggested none exists. I and so many others are deeply grateful to you for modeling that possibility. Professor McHenry is continuing that enterprise, and this week's lectures will look to areas of Black print culture that remain understudied, including the business of printing, the history of Black printers, and formats of Black literature that were inexpensively produced. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth McHenry to deliver the first of this year's A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography. Today's lecture is titled Black Bibliography, Here and Now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura. I'm thrilled to be here. We were joking before that this is a lecture where you're asked so far in advance that, of course, you say yes because you're like, oh, I can do this, no problem. And then, you fool around for about 1.5 years, and then you realize that you have 3 lectures to write. And so I'm thrilled to be here and to have the lectures themselves underway. Let me make sure this is working. You guys ready? Okay. Let me begin tonight by sharing with you an image from African American literary history. This image captures students at work in the printing office at Claflin University around 1899. A private historically Black university in Orangeburg, South Carolina, Claflin was founded by Alonzo Webster, a minister for the Methodist Episcopal Church who originally came from the state of Vermont to South Carolina as a missionary. In 1869, he received a charter from the state of South Carolina to establish a college that would prepare those who had been enslaved for the responsibilities of citizenship. From its inception, Claflin was to be a school dedicated to the education of freedmen and their children. It's the oldest historically Black college or university in the state of South Carolina. By now, this image of Claflin students engaged in printing may be familiar to you. Not only was it just up on the screen because I sent it in. In 2022, Claflin announced that it was a recipient of the Getty Images Photo Archive Grant for historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, an award meant to preserve and amplify the rich history of HBCUs by digitizing their collections of photographs. But even before this particular photograph was widely available and easily downloadable as part of the Library of Congress's Prints and Photograph Division, added to the collection as one of the miscellaneous photographs assembled and displayed at the 1900 Paris exhibition to show Negro progress. In recent years, it's gotten a lot of play, perhaps most significantly as the image used in the promotional materials for a major 2019 conference at the University of Delaware on Black bibliography and Black print culture, an event which brought together scholars of Black print, Black textuality, Black visual culture, and Black book arts to think in theoretical and practical ways about Black print forms and print workers. It's a high quality photograph that reproduces well, and also a fascinating one for scholars interested in Black literature and Black print, illustrating in an instant a history of Black printers, in this case, men and women, who the photograph shows at work in Claflin's printing shop. My lectures over the coming week will take up two simple questions that are inspired in part by this image. How will we tell the stories of these Black printers, and why is it important for us to do so? Surely photographs like this one carry important information about Black printers, including information about the machinery they used and the various aspects of the printing trade they learned. But rather than illuminate where and how to begin a study of Black printers, the images are more likely to draw attention to how daunting the task of recovering their history will be. Staged photographs of African-American students around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, like this one, are endlessly frustrating to look at, in part because the photographs make their human subjects appear as static and lifeless as the machines they are apparently working. Scholars have written extensively about the problematic nature of images made by white photographers commissioned to record the success of industrial arts and teacher training schools for formerly enslaved people. By far the most studied of these documentary photographs were taken by the white photographer Francis Benjamin Johnston, whose photographs of Hampton Institute for the 1900 Paris exhibition were probably what led Booker T. Washington to invite her to Tuskegee Institute in the fall of 1902. The images she took there, including this one of Black printers at work in Tuskegee's printing office, he used in his heavily illustrated account of Tuskegee's educational methods, Working with the Hands, which was published in 1904. But Johnson was only one of many photographers that were invited into the largest and most prominent of what was, by 1900, a network of schools for African Americans, in order to make visual records of Black education that were then used for promotional materials and appeared in books and magazines, as well as postcards and albums. The technical realities of early photography meant that creating photographic evidence of the students at work required absolute stillness on the part of the photographer's subjects during long camera exposures, and the scriptedness that was required led to a stiffness in the resulting photograph. The careful arrangement of the shot and the objective of making it communicate a certain skill or idea or theme to later audiences also contributed to the photograph's staginess. What is perhaps most provoking and disturbing for modern day viewers is the fact that almost none of the people in the pictures make eye contact with the camera, making it very difficult to feel their aliveness or sense them as capable of dynamic movement. Instead, the photographs function as a visual testimony or evidence of the technical, mechanical work of HBCUs, while also eerily dovetailing with the photographs of social science, as well as those that circulated in the registers of biological science, used to map deviant bodies in prisons, medical treaties, and scientific explorations into the nature of both gender and race. All of these things complicate our view of these printers, making them distinctly difficult to read. From these photographs, it seems impossible to know them. But are Black printers, in fact, unknowable? This question poses a significant challenge to scholars of African American literature and Black print culture studies, the stakes of which I will begin to address tonight. Interest in Black print culture studies has made it one of the most vibrant areas of African Americanist inquiry and one of the most active fields of literary study. But as my colleague Lisa Gittleman reminds us, the term print culture has become a sprawling catch-all, one that all too often neglects the very business of printing and the products of the printing business. In urging us to tend to the relevant multiplicities of print, Gittleman points specifically to the primary work done by most small local printing offices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, job printing. A 19th century term that represents printing that most often requires not more than a sheet or two of paper. Job printing encompassed a world of necessary print, including letterhead, invoices, notices, tickets, posters or broadsides, vouchers, cards, invitations, programs, and timetables, to name only a few. Driven by the rise of industrialization and the growing commercial marketplace, while also serving the print requirements of schools and associations, this kind of printing was increasingly in demand by the end of the 19th century. Printing was also becoming a more profitable business and trade. Improvements in the speed and economy of printing and the increased affordability of printing equipment itself fueled a profusion of job printing businesses. The quality of printing also improved dramatically during this time. By the beginning of the 20th century, printed matter looked better than it had in the past. New ornamental and decorative typefaces and the ability to more effectively and more accurately reproduce images and graphics were partially responsible for this. All of these developments gave life to the business of printing and made it a viable pathway for African Americans. In 1900, African-American educator and orator Booker T. Washington recalled the kinds of print products that were the general work of the Tuskegee Institute printing office. And he's looking back to 1888, when the school held its 7th anniversary celebration. On display at that event were blanks, checks, catalogs, promissory notes, diploma blanks, minutes of associations and conventions, annual reports, bills and letterhead, envelopes, circulars, handbills, invitations, business cards, and certificates. This list makes it easy enough to see why scholarship, and in particular literary scholarship, has overlooked this sort of printing. If it exists at all, evidence of job printing often gets isolated in the archives as ephemera, a word that highlights the transitory and elusive nature of its value. It also highlights what typically happens to the products of job printing through use. They get worn out and thrown away. Furthermore, the records of this branch of the print industry have infrequently been valued or preserved by librarians and archivists. In most cases, it's probable that these kinds of records were discarded when a business folded or changed hands. Although the lines between printers and publishers at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century were considerably more fluid than they are today, the emerging differences between printing and publishing left printers largely unattached to the kinds of correspondence with authors that has facilitated our knowledge of the publishing industry. If records of African-American job printing businesses exist at all, they are most likely to take the form of financial documents or monthly statements of account like this one, rather than a narrative of the work done or the experience of doing it. This makes even those records that do exist uneasily mined by literary scholars who are more attuned to drawing information from prose than numbers. But this serves as an important reminder. Printers were business people, and the numbers and tallies by which their work is represented indicates the delicate balance between the jobs they took on, the payments they received, and their costs and expenditures. The difficulty then of recovering the turn of the century, the history of turn of the century Black job printers, the small locally owned businesses they ran, and the print materials they produced is undeniable. But I hope my lectures this week begin to suggest the importance of doing so. What I'm ultimately interested in is how the business of printing and the work of African-American literature came together, or perhaps more precisely, how the work of African-American literature was embedded in the business of printing. Despite all we know about Black print culture, we're woefully ill-equipped to talk about the kind of printers who were in large part responsible for what has been described as the efflorescence of African-American print around the turn from the 19th to the 20th centuries. Across these years, the rise of African-American printers and local Black printing businesses vastly increased both the kinds of print that were produced by and for African Americans and the cultures of print in which they participated. Sometimes what they printed resembled what we're accustomed to studying in our literature classrooms. But Black printers also printed materials in genres and formats and on subjects that we have yet to fully recognize or critically engage with. These materials will lead us in new directions, not only because they point to different kinds of print that were important to different Black communities, but also because they direct us to different ways of experiencing print and practicing print culture studies. To date, our attention has been fixed on a relatively narrow set of print materials, written by a relatively narrow set of Black writers, read by a relatively narrow set of Black readers, and emerging for the most part from a relatively narrow geographical swath of the United States, the urban North. Studying Black printers in the South and the products of their various printing businesses offers one pathway for complementing and enriching what we already know about the products, the production and distribution of Black print, and about Northern, educated, and often elite African-American readers, while expanding our understanding of African-American literary history, even as we complicate its telling. Let me be upfront about what my lectures this week will only serve to underscore. This project is at its very beginning. All three of my lectures together represent a still uncertain, still disjointed experiment in how we might move toward a more complete history of Black print, one that takes up the work of Black job printers and maps the history of Black print culture and literary culture across the geographies of the Black South as fully and with as much complexity as we have begun to do in the Northeast United States. But I'm not there yet. My investment in bringing bibliographic methods to this work are threefold. First, I'm interested in how bibliographic methods might help us to understand the diversity and multiplicity of print objects that originated in a job printing business, which may have been job work, newspaper work, the work of institutions like schools, churches, or voluntary associations, or literary work. Is it possible to see the ways job printers merged or experimented with these print forms and formats, bringing them together in different ways for different audiences? Second, I hope bibliographic methods can help me discover and investigate material evidence that places Black people as readers, makers, and users of different kinds of print. Bibliographic methods can help me understand the ways that Black print was purposefully produced and how it circulated around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, and gauge the effect and the efficacy of strategic efforts to design and place certain kinds of print into the hands of different communities of Black people. Finally, bibliographic methods will help me orient my research towards recovering the print and literary history of those who were historically less privileged, less well-educated, and less likely to have access to either print materials or the kind of organized literary activities from which we have drawn much of our understanding of Black print and literary culture in the North. What I'm interested in is deepening our understanding of the Black literary cultures that might have existed in the South, especially in its rural and agricultural geographies. Black turn-of-the-century job printers, then, are only one aspect of this project, but they may be key to helping us shift our attention to different kinds of print that were valued by different African-American communities, as well as the different kinds of opportunities to publish that Black writers found or made, or those that they were denied. In recent years, we've made tremendous strides in gaining a better understanding of this. In my last book, I looked at two authors who, for a variety of reasons, did not find publishers for the writing about which they cared most: T. Thomas Fortune and Mary Church Terrell. The example of both of these writers illustrate the way Black literature was valued, but only if that writing reflected and reinforced the limiting and racist stereotypes affirmed by the middle and upper class white readers. Scholars have uncovered a variety of ways that African-American writers were more successful than Fortune and Terrell in finding opportunities to publish their work. A very few, most notably and most famously, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles Chestnut, worked with established northern printing houses whose responsibility it was to assume the quality of the work and oversee its marketing. Others, like Pauline Hopkins, sought publication within publishing houses funded by African Americans. Sutton E. Griggs founded his own company, the Orion Publishing Company, to facilitate the publication and distribution of his novels. It bears emphasizing that the difference in the early 20th century between the printer's work of physically putting words on paper and the publisher's work of selecting marketable material and assuming financial responsibility for the design, the production, and the promotion of a text was hardly as distinct as it is now. And it's clear that many different kinds of printers and publishers existed, leading to shifting vocabularies and blurred lines between the two kinds of literary professions. But it's likely that the majority of texts written by African Americans that found their way into print in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were produced not by publishers, but by job printers, whose willingness to take on any printing job, large or small, placed them in a position of putting an enormous variety of Black writing into print. Recent inquiries into what scholars have called Black self-publishing supports this claim. In his forthcoming book from UNC Press titled Published by the Author, Brian Cinch considers examples of early Black writers who sought out the means to publish their books independently, without the interference of white editor or publisher. Calling this history hidden, Cinch picks up on the line on the title page of so much African American literature that reads, "Published by the author" or "Printed for the author," and looks to understand the reasons for Black authors wanting, or in many cases, needing to publish a book. One of the things he identifies is the way that for some Black writers, self-publishing was an economic opportunity or a necessity. Casting these authors as entrepreneurs, Cinch chronicles the way that Black writers sought out buyers for their books after having their writing put into print by a job printer. His research complements the work being done at the American Antiquarian Society to identify books known to have been or that may have been self-published, whether in the Society's collections or not. Under the leadership and guidance of curator Elizabeth Pope, this ongoing collaborative research project is seeking help in identifying print materials that were self-published by people of African descent residing in North America, born before 1851 or first published before 1877, placing these texts roughly within the chronological parameters of the Society's collections. Part of the purpose of the project is to grapple with what we mean when we say self-published, which the American Antiquarian Society project defines as an author making arrangements with a printer, often the local newspaper office, to print their pamphlet or sermon or work of history, rather than going through an established commercial publisher. Their website is a good place to see the kinds of evidence gathered both from the Society's own collections and texts that are community sourced, that sheds light on the variety of writing Black Americans took it upon themselves to have printed. And the project promises to offer new avenues of research on even the most familiar Black writers. For example, the American Antiquarian Society holds a copy of Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of an American slave that was printed in 1848 in the office of the newspaper he was then editing, the North Star. Douglass's reprint of this text on the presses of his own newspaper 3 years after its original printing suggests that we revisit the 1845 version, the title page of which reads, "Published at the Anti-Slavery Office." Scholars have long considered that the first edition of this text from 1845 was published by the American Anti-Slavery Society. Will this research into self-publishing, the American Antiquarian Society's website asks us, insist we reconsider that understanding and question whether this most famous of narratives was actually self-published its printing initiated by Douglas himself and done at the anti-slavery office? Many of the texts that fit into this time frame, the time frame of the American Antiquarian Society project, were certainly printed by white-owned printing businesses, as was the Reverend George W. Offley's narrative of the life and labors of Reverend George W. Offley, a colored man. In 1859, Offley turned to the Hartford, Connecticut printing firm Case, Lockwood and Company to print his narrative, committing to pay $23.66 for 1,000 copies and paying the bill, as this invoice attests, across 3 installments. But by the end of the 19th century, printing was a trade increasingly occupied by African Americans. The rise of the printing programs at HBCUs was in large part responsible for this shift, which I argue changed the landscape of Black printing and at the same time laid the groundwork for a time of unprecedented production of and access to Black print. I'll speak directly to these programs in my third and final lecture this week. But to suffice to say here that evidence suggests that by the late 19th century, most cities and towns with a sizable Black population supported at least one Black-owned and operated printing business. The traces of these businesses most obviously take the form of advertisements for their services, which are scattered throughout the late 19th and early 20th century African-American newspapers. This ad from the Washington Bee in 1897 specifically mentions churches, benevolent societies, social clubs, military organizations, and labor and trade organizations, giving us a good sense of the kinds of organizations that were in need of printing services. This one, for the Black Dispatch Publishing Company of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, links its job printing businesses to both crucial support of the city's Black newspaper and the exhibition of race pride. No job is too big or too small. Church and lodge minutes, pamphlets, prospectuses, cards, envelopes, letterheads, yearbooks, dance programs, posters, and everything in the realm of printing. It reads, "We do it." The proprietor of the Black Dispatch, Roscoe Dungy, worked at the print shop at Langston University, the only Black college or university in Oklahoma, while he was attending the equivalent of 8th grade there. His first printing plant was an old jobbing press in a friend's basement, where he operated what would later jokingly be called Black Dispatch University, so named because of Dungy's determination to teach Black people how to print. This serves as a reminder that not all Black printers were trained at HBCUs, and stories of those who picked up skills on the job as apprentices or printers' devils in established printing businesses have much to tell us about how Black people learned the various aspects of the printing business and how they experienced the lasting value of their work as printers, even for those who did not remain in the trade. One of the most interesting of these is William Stanley Braithwaite's account of his early days as a printer's apprentice at the established Boston area publisher Ginn and Company. I think it's Ginn and Company, actually. In this autobiography, Braithwaite describes Ginn and Company as school and textbook publishers and outlines his experience learning the trade as a compositor. His description of the work is one of the most vivid I have encountered. I was first set the task of learning the case, he says, by distributing the type from the page forms that had returned from the foundry after the plates had been made. The case, now that the linotype and monotype machines in modern printing have rendered it useless, was a square, shallow box about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, with spaces of unequal size, holding the alphabetic letters in typecast lead. The alphabetic boxes did not run successively, but like the keys on a typewriter, were arranged so that the letters most frequently used in words were nearer the hand of the compositor as he stood at the center of the case for rapid pickup. One of the things that Braithwaite captures here is the rapidly changing technology of the printing business. He also captures the way in which his work as a printer amplified his own voice and opened up for him a world of literature. As Braithwaite puts it, Setting into type poems by Keats, Wordsworth, and Burns, he says, transported me into realms and awakened sensibilities that remade my world in terms of poignant imaginative desires. Inspired to compose his own poetry, he used the printing machines furtively to put them and I quote here, put them into type, and again surreptitiously place the type at the end of a galley of composition. Striking off the proof, Braithwaite writes, beheld the first printings of my poetic effusions. Braithwaite claims to have made scores of these privately printed verses of mine, and the print copies were treasured evidence of his artistic and intellectual ambitions and achievements. These illicit prints form the groundwork of his career spent writing and anthologizing African American and American verse. What Braithwaite makes clear is that it's not only the odor of fresh ink and damp paper that sets him on a path to a literary life. He's also inspired to read and appreciate literature and imagine writing it by the thrill of seeing words in print. Now, Ginn and Company was a large northern company, no doubt very different from the small Black printing businesses that came to dot the South and the Midwest at the beginning of the 20th century. And Braithwaite would, of course, go on to become an important Black writer, poet, and literary critic. He hardly had the sort of career or overall anonymity that most Black printers had, which is, of course, one reason his experience is visible to us today. He wrote about himself and his work as a young printer, and his archives include extensive collections at Harvard University and the University of Virginia, as well as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. These stories, and indeed these archives, will remain important resources for understanding Black printers and their work in the trade. Braithwaite's experience in learning to set type and of seeing his words in print begins to illuminate the meaning and potential of print for African Americans. Long excluded from print culture, even Braithwaite's formal education was minimal, and he credits much of his learning to the reading he did while on the job in the printing business. It is no wonder that African Americans embraced print so fully and entered the culture of printers so enthusiastically. It's worth remembering that law and custom across the South decreed that enslaved persons were not allowed to learn to read or to write. Interaction with print, much less control of it, was a threat to slavery's logic, so much so that in the state of Mississippi, it was illegal to train any Black person to work as a typesetter. Once printing became a set of skills taught at HBCUs, the trade became open to African Americans in unprecedented ways. On the one hand, becoming a printer and mastering the skills associated with putting ink on paper was just a job. As present-day Black letterpress printer Amos Kennedy observes, it wasn't anything special. On the other, control of a printing press had the potential to open up a world of expressive possibilities, all of which deserve our attention, and many of which point to Black print cultures and the potential for bibliographically oriented studies that we haven't even begun to appreciate or account for. My project on Black printers aims to redirect my own attention away from the urban North and its rich archives of Black literature and Black print culture, and away from the educated and relatively privileged African Americans that have been at the heart of much of what we know about 19th and early 20th century literature, and certainly 19th century African American literature as well. This was the population that caught my attention in 1993, when, as I completed my dissertation on an entirely different subject, my dissertation director handed me an article written by Howard University librarian, archivist, and bibliographer Dorothy Porter, entitled "The Organized Educational Activities of Negro Literary Societies, 1828 to 1846." Published in 1936, this was an article I might have passed over as too old to have been much use, had I been actively looking for sources of information on Black readers or African American literary societies on my own. But the truth is, I had never thought much about Black readers, and the idea that African Americans formed organizations around the study of literature long before the Civil War was far beyond the scope of my knowledge. Most studies of Black people as readers focused on African-American illiteracy, an association wound so tightly around Black people as to make their literate history virtually invisible. The singular identification of African-American literature as oral in nature and critical attention to literary studies to the Black vernacular also made it difficult to see or appreciate Black literate habits and traditions. The work of historians and literary scholars was focused largely on the experience of those who had been enslaved before the Civil War, and the tendency of literary criticism was to see narratives of the enslaved generally, and specifically those of two individuals, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, as the singular foundation of the African-American literary tradition. Educated in the midst of the race for theory, which is how Barbara Christian in 1987 came to describe the veritable takeover of a certain kind of theory in literary studies, graduate students like me had little or no experience working with archival materials, and precious few of us had the kind of guidance or mentorship that prepared us to recognize the ways studying African-American literature might perhaps require us to ask different questions and apply different approaches from those practiced by our peers. All of these things work to overshadow, or in some cases, render invisible the many, many forms of writing and sources of literature that we might have studied. And it rendered a study of Black readers practically inconceivable. I wrote Forgotten Readers not to contradict these methods and priorities, but to complement and enhance them by adding to our knowledge of Black readers and their literate habits and literary practices across the years from 1830 to 1940. Porter's article provided me with a starting place. Hold on. There we go. Porter's article provided me with a starting place, and her work guided me to various sources of information on Black readers and the context in which African Americans came together around the study of literature. It also redirected my attention to various sites of literature that had gone unappreciated in the recent past. African American newspapers and periodicals, for instance, emerge in Forgotten Readers as crucial sites of African American literature, as well as literary exchange. The Black press itself provided me with an extensive record of both Black literature and literary activity. Through its careful reading, I came to understand the key terms and ideas through which Black people conceptualized and defined Black print culture, and the ways they participated in it, in both physical spaces and on the page, as a way of shaping their own identities, priorities, and communities. In this, I came to see Black literary culture as focused on a very different print tradition than that represented by bound books or well-known authors. One of the central claims of Forgotten Readers is that to understand Black readers, we must expand our understanding of the range, complexity, and diversity of African Americans' definition of literacy, literature, and literary practice. One of the first things that became clear to me early on in my research for the book is that the very definition of what counts as literature shifts over time. It all sounds so silly now. It's like, yeah. The materials of our 19th century ancestors considered literature was broad and deep, a constellation of almost anything they could find in print. This included poetry and fiction, but also scientific writing, maps, the records of conferences and associations, the text of speeches, and a huge variety of writing that we would today describe as broadly educational rather than specifically literary. Definitions, all these things were, to their mind, the objects of literary study. Definitions of literacy in the early 19th century were also very different than ours are today. So much so that literary societies included not only those with the ability to read and write for themselves, but also those who were actively listening to texts read by another person, which allowed them to know and productively engage in literary culture. Understanding cultures of shared literacy helped to contextualize the many different kinds of relationships African Americans have had with print, including those referred to by early Black writers like Jupiter Hammond and David Walker, who specifically instructed those who could read to read their writing to those who could not. It also helps to contextualize the experience of Frederick Douglass's wife, Anna Murray Douglass, who we know to have been a member of a Baltimore Literary Society when she met Frederick Douglass, but who we also know to have remained unable to read for herself throughout her whole life. So Forgotten Readers was written a very long time ago, before Black print culture studies became a thing, and certainly well before this sort of study was widely expected or accepted. As a young scholar, it was difficult to place the work I did. It was judged to be too historical for a literature scholar, and the fragments and incomplete knowledge with which I worked called into question for some the rigor of my scholarship. Without digitized or searchable materials, I read through each and every issue of countless newspapers and periodicals on microfilm. And while I have not 1 ounce of nostalgia for the old days, when I spent countless hours in the dizzying light of the microform reader in any number of library basements, I do appreciate all I learned from what was literally years of reading 19th century Black print. I eventually found the history of the book and gratefully settled on it as the field that best represented the work that I did. And it helped to make my work legible to others. And it was just interesting to hear Laura talk about it, because I think it was like I was a lone history of the book person, because it gave me a home. It gave me like an intellectual center. I also found a lot of help. I cannot fathom how I would have moved forward without the example of the dialogic style and exploratory tone of Frances Smith Foster's scholarship, which gave license to studies of an ever-widening notion of print culture, while also modeling modes of inquiry built around asking questions and talking through unashamedly incomplete accounts of Black print. What we know now is that these incomplete accounts ultimately lead to a better telling of African-American literary history, but this hasn't always meshed with ideas of authoritative scholarship. Carla Peterson's insistence that scholars must sometimes speculate, and her own example of how to do it in ways that were both responsible and productive, also gave me the confidence to work in more and more productive ways with the information I did have. Both of these scholars cast fragments of information, or what Carla Peterson would come to call scraps, as the necessary building blocks of the deeper, fuller account of Black print culture that by necessity would have to be assembled bit by bit. They showed how difficult this work was, how intellectually risky, but they also claimed how essential it was to take these risks. Finally, I should acknowledge here that some of the help I got in becoming a better researcher and a more careful reader did not come from academic sources. As soon as I started my project on literary societies, people began to bring me fat envelopes filled with Black print. I started ordering things that looked and sounded interesting on eBay and from used bookstores. And these are sites I still rely on for much of the material that I study. I also learned a tremendous amount by talking to my grandparents. My grandfather, born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1902, and my grandmother, born in Washington, D.C. in 1905. The way they spoke in particular about their clubs, the Pigskin and Bachelor Benedict Club for my grandfather. And this is, my grandfather's in the first row, the third from my side. And here, he's in the second row, the second from my side. He's much older. I don't think I'd ever seen him as young as the first picture. The way they talked about their clubs, for my grandfather, the Benedict Bachelor and the Pigskin Club. For my grandmother, her mother's club, and the Little Paris group, shown here in 1948, where she painted and critiqued art alongside other African Americans. She's really short. She's the third one in, one person low, two, and she's the third one who looks shorter. And again, she's so young. Their stories told me a lot about what belonging and collectivity meant to African Americans at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a short leap to see how this was engendered in Black print. Records like this, my grandmother's report card from Howard University's Normal School from 1925, make tangible aspects of Black history that might otherwise have remained unimaginable. There's no doubt in my mind that the best projects begin with documents like this and those seemingly random and out of place things found in earlier trips to the archives that for some reason won't let you go. They compel you to return to them from time to time, to think anew about how to place them. This was the case with a stack of Mary Church Terrell's unpublished short stories, which I had found in Xerox in the summer of 1993 while working on what would become Forgotten Readers. That box also contained the cover letters through which she introduced those stories to editors of the nation's top literary magazines when submitting them for consideration, as well as countless letters from the editors in response to her stories. These letters of rejection, and they were all letters of rejection, led me to wonder about the distance between Terrell's apparent success as an activist and her failure as a writer of fiction. Her stories looked to me like an important part of the historical record. And yet apparent failure, or the aborted, the thwarted, the unfinished, is rarely the subject of study, and literary history seldom privileges what's unsuccessful, whether in terms of writers or texts that were never recognized by publication, or projects that were imagined but never completed or remained unfulfilled. Terrell herself blamed her failure as a writer of short stories on the fact that she did not live in what she called a literary atmosphere. So I wanted to linger in that atmosphere, to worry the meaning of this phrase and sentiment, to make visible on a granular level exactly what Terrell's literary atmosphere, or lack thereof, looked like. To do this, I turned my attention to a particular historical moment, the years that tightly surrounded the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. Scholars have tended to think of the literature created in these years as a part of either an extended understanding of a new Negro or Harlem Renaissance movement, or as contained in an even wider postbellum pre-Harlem interval that runs from 1877 to 1915. My own sense was that this periodicity had allowed us to bypass the specificity, the particularity, the texture and detail of the intervening years. In Terrell's case, without lingering on the years that surrounded the turn of the century, how could we recognize and come to terms with those aspects of literary culture she recognized and most readily identified with, that defined her own life and her assessment of that life? At its earliest conception then, the book was imagined as two things. First, a series of case studies that would begin to illuminate the literary atmosphere of this particular moment. And second, a methodological inquiry about how scholars might look for and begin to conceive of literary history in time periods and situations in which it appears to be absent. What the series of texts, projects, and practitioners that I turn to and to make Negro literature make visible is the unsettledness of the very category of Black literature in the years between 1896 and 1910, even to those working in the field. The things I studied, books sold by subscription, forms of print long considered reference tools rather than genres of any value in themselves, forms of authorship that are today disrespected, and writing that simply fails to appear in the venues we think of when we think of publication, begin to reveal African-American literature's workspaces and its working conditions at the very beginning of the 20th century. What I attend to to make Negro literature is those literary projects and people that laid practical and conceptual groundwork for African-American literature and the transmission of literary culture that lie just below the surface of the known world of African-American literary history. The book answers a series of important questions. What kinds of writing and conditions of authorship have underwritten what have been valued as African-American literature? What sorts of investments stand behind the most visible literary productions? And what kinds of interactions played supporting roles in the era's literary landscape? In what structures can we see the intellectual bases of literature and literary culture taking shape? The goal of this book was to bring to the fore what lies hidden, often in plain sight, in the background of literary history, as a way to rejigger both our understanding of turn-of-the-century African-American literary culture and our conception of the appropriate objects of African-Americanist literary inquiry. In doing so, the book intends to expand the scope of literary studies, but it also intends to rectify our own scholarly neglect. We have dismissed as unworthy of attention certain kinds of productions, texts, and events that are not lost then, or even forgotten, but in fact disregarded. So there was a fifth chapter to this book, and it was on Du Bois's early journalism, which in the end did not sit well with the book's focus or its argument. One reason for this was that in writing about his Du Bois's early editorial practices, I was distracted by a different story. In 1903, around the same time that The Souls of Black Folk was published, Du Bois quietly purchased a Memphis printing business. In this printing office, Du Bois did not himself participate in the physical acts associated with printing. And we should hardly consider any venture in which he was involved in the early years of the 20th century, when he was already an accomplished scholar and increasingly recognized as an important Black leader, as typical. But what he did in the modest Memphis job printing office, which I'll talk about more fully in tomorrow night's lecture, drew me to the neglected importance of the jobbing press and to its centrality to the production of both Black print and African-American literature. Du Bois's printing business, then, was a stepping stone to the work of Black printers who did not have Du Bois's stature or level of education and privilege. And as I've come to see it, Black printers are themselves a stepping stone to worlds of Black print and print cultures that our histories and bibliographic studies have yet to account for. So my new project hopes to model an ambitious agenda for spreading the boundaries of Black print culture studies to more fully include Black people in the Deep South. To think about the Black South is to wrestle with the aftermath of slavery in urgent and immediate ways. From the earliest U.S. population statistics until about 1910, more than 90% of the U.S. population lived of African Americans in the U.S. population lived in the American South. Overlooking this population in the study of Black print culture is to account for only a small fraction of the print and the culture with which Black people were engaged. To address literary culture in this context is to confront the fact that by 1900, just under half of all African Americans in the South remained illiterate. It also requires that we face some of the most difficult aftermaths of slavery, including the South's racist labor economy, which included sharecropping, tenant farming, and convict lease labor. It is to grapple with the rural and agricultural lives led by Black Southerners, the vast majority of whom subsisted in various levels of poverty without access to much in the way of opportunities or education. It's to sit with the social conditions and Jim Crow laws that upheld racial segregation and discrimination, as well as the rampant racial violence that accelerated in the aftermath of Reconstruction, both of which over time drove Black people in substantial numbers to leave the South and seek out new homes in the Northeast, the Midwest, and in Western cities. In taking on the geography of the Black South, I'm accepting Jarvis McInnes's invitation to revisit the former plantations on which many Black Southerners worked to build new lives after emancipation, as well as his commitment to thinking critically about Tuskegee Institute and other historically Black colleges and universities, which I argue we must more carefully and more judiciously consider as major sites for the production of Black print and the distribution of Black literature around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. What I hope to make sense of in this project are the kinds of print that were produced in the printing offices of both institutional presses, like those of Tuskegee Institute, and other historically Black, those of Tuskegee and other historically Black colleges and universities across the South, as well as that which was produced in the small local printing offices, often opened and staffed by those who learned to print in their printing programs. As you saw in the ad for the Black Dispatch's job printing services, some of these printing offices were connected to the Black press, the textured history of which sits at the center of Black print culture studies. This overlap between job work and newspaper work, as well as that between job work, newspaper work, and what we might describe as book work, even when this didn't only include books, complicates the story of Black printers in fascinating ways. But this line of inquiry will also bring me closer to what Frances Smith Foster has described as a treasure trove of print that demands our attention, which includes, but is certainly not limited to, funeral programs, temperance literature, denominational church and Sunday school literature, including songbooks and hymnals, and all sorts of HBCU institutional literature. This she calls the literature of the domestic and the mundane, which includes what she describes as the vast amount of unrecovered literature and most of the writing that chronicles and informs the folk. Significantly, this body of literature includes an array of different print formats, which include the pamphlets, broadsides, and leaflets produced by HBCU printing offices, but distributed not on their campuses, but in their outreach work, which we might think of as one way the conditions for Black study came into being and were extended in the rural South. This project depends upon the archives and special collections of HBCUs, which are a rich and generally underused source of print written by and produced for African Americans. The HBCU Library Alliance, as well as its significant partnerships and collaborations, has gone far in ensuring the preservation of HBCU printed materials. And because the Alliance has prioritized digitization, scholars have access to a tremendous amount of print through a single searchable portal. This will not replace going to these repositories or poring over the vast array of physical documents they house, since the bulk of HBCU's collections, including the monumental Booker T. Washington papers, are not digitized. Researchers engaging with these archives will find an abundance of print, so much, in fact, that simply getting your bearings in the collection can be an overwhelming task. But the project also brings us face to face with one of the key challenges for scholars of Black print culture. Much of the print produced in small printing offices that Black people in the rural Black South encountered is likely not to have survived. How can you study printed documents that once existed, but that are not physically preserved? Or to put the question another way, the way scholar Janet Kung Chow does in her study of The Demonstrator, a Mount Bayou, Mississippi newspaper from the turn of the century, for which there are no extant copies. What happens to Black print culture when the printed material is lost to us? Can the impact and legibility of print outlast its fragile form? You'll see me struggle with this question toward the end of tomorrow night's lecture in ways that aren't entirely satisfactory, but that address head-on the very real challenges of working at the intersection of Black print and Black bibliographic analysis. As my very presence here today as the 2024 A.S.W. Rosenbach lecturer implies, this is an excellent time to take on this project and others that promise to expand the scope of what we think of and where we turn when we study Black print culture, and indeed, the purposes and practices of Black bibliography. To the best of my knowledge, Black bibliography has never been the focus of a Rosenbach lecture, a series widely advertised as the longest continually running series of bibliographic lectureships in the United States. It's also possible that I'm the first Black scholar to be honored with an invitation to deliver these lectures. This is the sort of recognition that our ancestors deserved, and that it is coming now is a valuable, if long overdue, tribute to their groundbreaking and innovative bibliographic practices. Embedded in their formal and informal efforts to collect, study, record, organize, classify, and preserve access to Black print and the records of Black literary culture are bibliographic materials developed in response to the specific conditions and constellations of Black print and the needs and concerns of the Black community. The enumerative and descriptive lists and bibliographies they compiled, the articles they wrote, the facts they emphasized, the questions they asked, the problems they pointed to, and the knowledge systems they valued have created the very roadmaps that scholars like me continue to follow today. There's much to learn from the vibrant work of Black bibliographers across the 20th century, and to see that work take center stage, not only in the context of this lecture series, but also across professional organizations committed to bibliography, is an excellent start to a new era of greater and more consistent dialogue about how to advance bibliographic studies toward the goal of more inclusive methods and practices. Driving this are two important things. The first is the extraordinary scholarship of a handful of talented literary historians who have committed themselves to ensuring that the history of Black bibliography is known and that conscientious attentiveness to Black bibliographic practices continues to enrich the study of Black print moving forward. One thing that has ensured the telling of these stories is the fact that they're being recorded by scholars with deep roots in information science and literature and history. For example, Jesse Erickson's account of his own experience working at the intersection of professional, archival, and bibliographic practice and Black print culture studies is deeply sensitive to the benefits of each field to the other. Laura Helton, who did my awesome introduction, whose book is right there, and ironically, I own a copy and she doesn't. Laura Helton shares a similar background, which positioned her to tell the story of how a dedicated group of Black collectors, curators, archivists, and librarians worked to create Black archives in the first half of the 20th century in her brilliant book, Scattered and Fugitive Things, which is forthcoming momentarily from Columbia University Press. Among other things, it's a study that highlights the crucial and field-defining work that was done by librarian archivist Dorothy Porter to organize Black history in a way that ensured its study would be expansive rather than narrow, and its materials easily located. Through Helton's work, we can now see more clearly than ever the ways that Black bibliography and other forms of recording information about the Black past was and still is a personal responsibility, an intellectual mandate, and a political imperative. That our ancestors were compelled to document, collect, archive, and bibliographically account for the Black past is indicative of their determination to show that the intellectual terrain has always been marked by the presence of Black bodies, as Elizabeth Alexander has put it. Finally, and I'm necessarily leaving out many more exciting projects and scholars from this overview, Derek Spires has beautifully theorized Black bibliography as a conscious and intentional practice of identifying and repairing the harms of systematic racism, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and other repressive structures in and through bibliography and bibliographic study. That is, the study of any aspect of the production, dissemination, and reception of various kinds of text-bearing objects. This practice Spires calls liberation bibliography for good reason. At its heart, it is intended to make visible those knowledge systems and sites of knowledge production, activism, and imagination that institutions in the United States have historically rendered invisible or irrelevant. By detailing the parameters of Black bibliographic practice and the decisions Black archivists, curators, collectors, and librarians made in the past that purposefully expanded our understanding of the parameters of Black history and Black writing, these scholars are working to ensure that later generations will not see bibliography as a fussy, boring, or outdated discipline that leaves Black writing unaccounted for, but rather as a vibrant and varied practice desperately needed to make Black writing in all its depth and complexity fully visible. The second thing that makes this a great time to embark on the projects at the intersection of Black print culture studies and Black bibliography is the very fact of the Black Bibliography Project, a project that Jackie Goldsby and Meredith McGill, alongside a network of librarians, archivists, curators, and scholars, some still in graduate school and some quite advanced in the profession, are busy at work on. The Black Bibliography Project was designed to both revive the tradition of descriptive bibliography in Black studies, while at the same time bringing its bibliographic methods into the electronic age in a way that suits the needs of Black print. Their description of the ways traditional Anglo-American bibliography is insufficient for the needs of studying Black print are worth quoting at length. Bibliography as a discipline, they write, doesn't necessarily reflect the values that African Americanist, scholarly, and curatorial communities have long brought to the practice of preserving Black texts. Tied to a market for rare books that prizes scarcity, traditional bibliography winnows and straightens out the often convoluted pathways of a text circulation, telling the story of publication as an enumerated list of firsts. But we know Black print culture doesn't work like that. Black print culture is characterized by overlapping histories of reprints and reissues, excerpts, lags, and revivals. Black print frequently circulates outside of and below the radar of mainstream publishing houses and trade journals. Black print culture intersects with that of white authors and publishers, but it has its own tempo, its own pressures to negotiate, and requires a different set of institutional structures and alliances to thrive and survive. What bibliographic models, they asked at the inception of the project, could capture and distill this flux while also reflecting Black print culture's particular modes of literary production? The answer? A data model they developed to allow for the recording of detailed metadata about Black print. So it's technically be outside of my wheelhouse. But let me suffice to say that it will make my work not just easier, but infinitely better by allowing for connections between texts and easy linked access to an enormous amount of information about individual literary works, including those embedded in newspapers and the periodical press. It will be able to tell me where and when texts are subsequently reprinted in other sources. It'll show me works printed by a common printer and even assemble the names inscribed in books that record and trace their ownership. So, for instance, the database may be able to show me what other books might have been owned by J.H. Gordon of Durant's Neck, North Carolina, who used a blank page of this canvassing book for the Encyclopedic Progress of a Race, published in 1900, to practice his signature. Gordon committed, totally different source, Gordon committed to Black education, Gordon's commitment to Black education led him to contribute 50 cents to a fund to help build a building for the colored normal school at Elizabeth City, North Carolina in 1905 and 1906. Might the Black Bibliography Project allow us to find other books he wrote in toward a goal of reconstructing his library? Could it help us to know whether he sold other books by subscription? All of the work I've just cited are reasons we can't be content in this here and now, to tread the same well-worn paths that lead us to and through African-American literary history in the urban North. It's a good time to expand our purview, even as we acknowledge how much more there is to do, even in this area. I should note that I'm not the only one making this call. This is more or less exactly what Eric Gardner argued in his 2010 book, Unexpected Places, a study intended to broaden the list of authors, texts, and places we consider in discussing 19th century African-American literature. He's making a related argument now in his work on Reconstruction era Black literature by urging us to right the wrong-headed assumption that there essentially wasn't an African-American literature of Reconstruction. Frances Smith Foster has for years been pointing to both these things: the tendency of Black literary scholars to pool around familiar areas of study, to simply skip from the narratives of a small number of enslaved individuals to the Harlem Renaissance, and to stick close to what she has called the cultural freeway from Boston to Philadelphia to New York City, at the expense of what she calls the highways and byways of the rest of the United States. Working toward a true and complete history of Black print, we can't afford to fall into patterns of practicing print culture study that close off some of the very cultures or the very print or print workers that we most need to make sense of. The work that awaits us is imperative, requiring that we waste no time in getting to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think we have time for a few questions. I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, John Pollock. Keep an eye on questions.
That was, is this on? Yeah, that was marvelous. Thank you so much. Not a scholar in the field, but I'm interested in some of your favorite tidbits that you found from, eBay, et cetera, scraps, the scrappiest of scraps that like stimulated you.
Okay, I'm going to give you this so you can develop your. So last week, I got in the mail from eBay. I got one of the bronze booklets. Elaine Locke did a series of bronze booklets, so it was not like 1939 into the 40s, where it was purposefully a form of essentially extending education outside of the university structures, which is something I'm kind of thinking over. So I've been looking at like different forms of Black study that take place not in institutions of formal educational institutions. Another thing, and actually I'm laughing because one of the people who handed me an envelope of stuff that has one of my favorite things in it is Michael Winship and my former colleague at UT Austin, Mia Carter. I think, I don't remember whether her uncle had died or anyway, she came in with this huge stack of stuff. And one of the things is this very, very tiny little, well, I mean, it's only this tall. It's just a little pocket American history. I'm kind of fascinated with the way, with different print formats that are tiny and that were meant to be carried around. And so they were meant to be available, anytime. You could pull it out and do a little either studying or reading. So that's another one of my favorite things. And then I've got like some receipts and stuff, which I think are pretty cool. I'm working towards receipts from printing businesses. They're very hard to come by. But mostly, I mean, I love things also that have writing in them, like writing, like the slide, like this slide, where you see the history of the user as well to some extent. So the other cover was all math figures. And I think I speculated at the time that it was either someone practicing their math or just doing random math, or someone calculating, because it was a canvassing book, someone calculating how much they were owed or, how much they'd earned. So stuff like that, I'm really into.
And I should note that it will be worth coming on Wednesday morning when we're going to get a chance to see some of the wonderful things that you've collected on eBay and these other places.
Yeah, I grabbed for the seminar. I just grabbed like a bunch of stuff and I have no idea what's in it. But we'll look at it and we'll have some fun with it and just see what's there.
Hi, that was really great. I am a printer, but I've been working on this project in the West, in Colorado. I'm wondering if any of your research has taken you west. I've been working on a press that was about 1910 it started. In that newspaper, we have every newspaper from 1910 to 1969 until it closed. But I know there were a lot of, like, there was a Buffalo Soldier sort of movement out there and a lot of presses. I wonder if you found anything out west.
So I haven't really looked for this project out west, and I feel like I like randomly found a Black printer in 1897 in Tacoma, Washington, but I wasn't looking. But I will say that what is so interesting about the way Black people moved is they followed, opportunities. So mining in Colorado meant that there was a huge Black population there. And so for Forgotten Readers, for instance, oddly to me, one of the Black women's clubs that many of the Black women's clubs that I found the most on were from Colorado. So I think it is, that if you follow some of these, not professions, jobs, like mining and the like, that's one way to follow both Black newspapers and also Black print culture and things that help you understand Black print culture, like women's club movement records. But it'd be really interesting. I mean, I think you might look at Eric Gardner's Unexpected Places, because I think he does do more in the Midwest and the West than I do.
Thank you. This was great. It's very exciting to see you working on a new project. You mentioned that this is still in its early stages. I'm wondering if you could talk about what's been challenging so far the most in terms of getting results or, finding what you're looking for. Often you mentioned, ephemera is destroyed or projects that are rejected or fail are not kept by whoever's doing it. And in my own work, I've found that you end up interacting with families, and you plundered your own family archive. And I'm wondering if is it the family that becomes the last kind of frontier of possibility for something having been kept, or where do you find that final hope, or where does the challenge lie in actually finding something?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. I think, I mean, when I think back on my grandparents' house, they moved out of where they'd lived forever in Northeast DC, in their 80s. And, cleaning out the house was like such an enormous job. And when I think about all the things that went out, it just makes me feel like literally sick. I mean, it was like all of us could have had careers for, our whole lifetime of projects. But I do think so. You have to get it at the right time, right? You have to get it at the right moment. And so for the work I do, like, I feel like I'm a little, I mean, for the work that I've done, like in the 19th and 20th century, finding people who are at that moment where all that stuff they've been collected is in the right time period is a little iffy. I will say that I can tell you like a couple things that I mean, these are kind of like things I'd rather keep secret. So here goes. I mean, I think one of the things that's really been hard for me, even just in the last month writing up these lectures, is that I'm not really sure what the project is on, right? So for me, it started with this one treasure trove of information on this one printing office. And that led me in a way that I'll talk about tomorrow night. That led me literally into the South. I mean, I was compelled to try and follow this one document into the South. And so it kind of, I thought the project was on black printers. Like I would go to a different black printer in a different place, like Colorado, and I would sort of write up that story. And but now I think the project, now I'm wondering whether is it really about printers, or is it about is that just a conduit to get me where I need to be? So that's the first thing. The second thing is totally related to that. I keep ending up back in the North, right? Because our documents are what we have here. The richness of what we have here is so extraordinary. And of course, it's not only the richness of the archives themselves, it's also the richness of the archivists and the librarians, and just our access is so extraordinary from the institutions from which we're looking. So, I'm at every turn, I have to keep asking myself, I have to keep talking myself back into what I think I'm studying. And so even when I get down into the South, all of a sudden I realize that I'm not looking where I thought I was looking. I'm actually looking at some, sort of sidebar conduit in some sense. So I, none of it is like wasted time. Ultimately, feels a little weird here, to be like, let's do this great project, and to be like, well, I wonder whether 2 years from now the project will still be on what I think it's on.
Well, this kind of follows on from what you were saying there, because I thought, one of the strands today was geographic.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, I thought it was really interesting that the ads, I really liked your emphasis on the local printing shop. I think that's a really nice direction of our attention. The two ads you put up from local printing shops is interesting. They both really stress that they give special attention to orders in the mail. And one said that they would have right of way, presumably because you got to get it back in time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and the right of way, I'd never heard it called that, but the because I don't work in this period.
Right.
But earlier that was all, that's crucial, is what jobs do you stop to take on the other job, and like what job goes
Yeah,
ahead
right
and
away.
jumps the queue.
Yeah.
And so I thought that, because in an interesting way, at least to a certain extent, that bit of the ad kind of undercuts the geographic distinctions that you were drawing, right? So now we have to think about these other networks.
Yeah.
I don't know how far those networks would have stretched, or if they're talking about even in-state
Mm-hmm.
mail.
Yeah.
But I just wondered if you had thought or encountered more materials that would really sort of give us an insight into Black print in the mail.
It's so funny because I think the mail is a crucial piece of at least this first part of the project, right? Because part of, well, I'll tell you tomorrow, but part of this first, Du Bois's printing shop is in Memphis, right? And Memphis is, I've learned a lot about like Memphis and Tennessee. It's like, there's a reason FedEx went there, right? It is smack dab distribution hub. And it always has been for rail, for post. So to think about like what was possible because the mail became this conduit of print. That's really interesting. I haven't really gotten further on that. I think in some way it's also related to probably around the same moment is when lynching postcards start flying through the mail before they're banned. So there's like a whole project to be done, I think, on the way that whether it's racial literature or literature around race kind of circulates. But I think one thing I was just going to say is that those ads, like I handpicked ads that were like kind of fun. So, but those, the Black Dispatch in Oklahoma, I'm kind of I wish it were in the South because I'm really fascinated and I have to kind of stop myself from doing too much on that. But it's like a fascinating paper and a fascinating like story of how the printing business got up and running. And I wonder what is meant by what is the extent to which they would really do like printing for like where? So I think it's a really good question. I think it's certainly part of this project if it unfolds in the way it looks like it is.
I have a question here from the online audience from Diane Moses from Black Ives LLC. And she said, has the Afro-American newspaper influenced your research? And if so, could you elaborate on any insights or discoveries you've made through its content?
Does it look like it's a specific newspaper or like
it's it's AFRO, American Newspaper / Printing Company.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny because I'm like, that has been in there.
And someone has invited you, Savannah Wood has invited you to meet us in the middle in Baltimore and love to have you visit the Afro News Archives.
Oh, great. Okay,
So.
good. So that newspaper, I'm just trying to remember it because I feel like I have something. So if they email me, I'll pull it out. I can't pull it out right now, but I feel like there might be something that I have found. And yeah, Baltimore, anywhere on the train, I'm so easy. So that'd be great.
And I think with that, we're going to thank Elizabeth and take a few minutes to have a nice glass of wine and talk a little bit more about this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.